Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like, to check the Jumbotron first, before attempting to eat a stack of Supreme nachos in one bite. Now you're just a meme that everyone shares on game day. Checking first is smart, so check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary, subject to terms, conditions, and availability. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates, Northbrook, Illinois.
Business taxes. Was stressing about all the time and all the money you spent on your taxes.
This is my bill?
Now Business Taxes is a TurboTax small business expert who does your taxes for you and offers year-round advice at no additional cost, so you can keep more money in your business. Now this is taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on turbotax.com/business. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
The Athletic.
We compare the concepts of the Big Four teams, and Gary answers your questions on a wide range of topics, from anti-dive and Lewis Hamilton's driving style to Bahrain's test track credentials and development ceilings, as we look ahead to the start of the F1 season. The Race F1 Tech Show is back after its winter hiatus, and with the Australian Grand Prix just round the corner and pre-season testing in the history books, there's plenty to get into ahead of the new season. I'm Edd Straw, and I'm delighted to have the real star of the show, Gary Anderson, joining me. So welcome back, Gary. I make this your 53rd season since you first became directly involved in F1, so are you ready to go for another year?
Oh yes, always ready to go. I mean, it's just waiting for the racing to start. It's been a sort of long winter for some of us. Obviously, it's been pretty short for the teams, to be honest. But I've managed to catch the dreaded lurgy over the winter. So if you hear me going into a coughing fit or a sneezing fit, it's not intentional by any means. So, but yeah, I'm looking forward to the season starting because, all the testing, all the rumour mill, the whole bit, it's all a waste of time until the checkered flag falls at that first race and we see who did what. And even then, it still takes a few races for everybody to sort of stabilise their new package. So it's never black and white. But obviously, going off to Australia now, the old problem is that Melbourne, you can get 4 seasons in one day. So who knows what will pop up, whether it'll be a good weekend or a in-between weekend. But, we will have an indication by the end of that Grand Prix weekend.
Well, we've already had some weird weather this year with things fairly chilly in Bahrain, unusually. So, who knows what we'll get when we get to Melbourne. But obviously, although it's only when we get to Australia that we get something that counts, we've seen testing, we've seen the cars in great detail. So we've started to piece together the technical storylines of the year. And I think probably the really interesting thing is to, amid all the talk of convergence of the cars, we still see some differences in approach. Obviously, there's still expected to be that top 4 group of Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren and Mercedes this year. So I really wanted to have a look at those 4 cars and what you've made of them in terms of the similarities and particularly the differences of those. I know Ferrari was one a few team people picked out as almost the outlier in terms of the approach they've taken. Christian Horner certainly pointed to it as that. So maybe there's an interesting place to start, what we're seeing in terms of the commonality and what we're seeing in terms of where there's been some deviation among those leading 4 teams.
Yeah, I think, everything will always converge at some point in time. These regulations now have been around since 2022. So they're fairly mature now. Everybody's got their head around what they're like or what to do. But, as I was saying, just commenting on the 4 big teams as such, we've now got three of those big teams have got pull rod front suspension on, for example. And there's still one with push rod, the Mercedes. Again, it's the same old story. There's no magic bullet in any of this stuff. It's a combination of suspension and aerodynamics that gives you the end result of the performance. And you can either go out chasing downforce and, making the underfloor work harder or diffuser work harder or, really focusing on the aerodynamic profile of the car. Or you can try and control that aerodynamic profile and make sure you're getting the best out of it or the most out of it at all times. Now, again, we're talking about suspension geometers, anti-dive and anti-lift, and that's all about controlling that aero platform. But it's not quite as black and white as what you see. Nothing ever is. There's a lot more to it than just, look at that, the wishbones, for example, on the McLaren. They're visibly very extreme as far as anti-dive on the front top wishbone is concerned. Whereas the Ferrari isn't as extreme by any means. So, maybe the characteristics of the McLaren suit it to have that extreme anti-dive. Maybe the characteristics of the Ferrari suit having less anti-dive. It's one of those sort of things that sort of relates to driver a little bit, and it's about driver feel. Once you start to lock a suspension up to resist the load transfer and stop the car moving whenever you're in a transient condition like braking for a corner and turning in, then the driver loses a bit of that feel. So again, it's all down to the drivers you've got, how young and spirited they are, I suppose you might call it. And again, the whole philosophy of the company, what you're trying to do. And again, we can only comment on what we see. Now, if you take front suspension, for example, there's a lot goes on with the bottom front wishbone as well, which you really can't see very well, the detail of it, because of very few pictures show it like the top front wishbone, because of the front wing being on the car most of the time, etc., etc. So it's not just as black and white as saying, look at this. You can look at it and you can say these are the extremes for sure, and McLaren have gone one route, and Ferrari have probably not gone quite as far. And the other two, the Mercedes and the Red Bull, are sort of in the middle there somewhere. I mean, as I say, McLaren are probably the extreme, Red Bull next, Mercedes, then Ferrari. And then all the other teams fit in there somewhere as well.
And it's the interesting question, isn't it? Particularly when you get into a rule set that's quite mature. This is the last year of the current rules package. It's balancing up that desire to push on and be more extreme with not putting yourself into a difficult area where you're just going too far, because everything comes with a compromise, doesn't it? And even though there's a certain characteristic that's very beneficial, you can, by pushing that too hard, then set yourself back just too far in other areas. So I guess that's the big challenge, isn't it? Balancing up, is this enough or is this not enough? But it was interesting to hear all the teams have talked about the need to push. McLaren have been quite open about being innovative and aggressive at what they've done. Ferrari have admitted that their previous concept was kind of topping out in terms of gains, so they had to change some things. Red Bull looks similar, but they stress it's very, very different under the surface, and obviously Mercedes have plenty of problems to work on, so they all had good reasons to push on and make a step, but they all have that risk of going too far in some aspects, I guess.
Yeah, well, with any design package, once it's up and running, as the cars for 2025 are now, that's what you've got. You're committed to that, and okay, you can sort of dot the I's and cross the T's around the car, but it's very, very difficult to actually change them dramatically. For example, the suspension. If McLaren wanted to reduce the anti-dive in their car, it would be a bit of a cut and shut job. And it would add weight, it would add complexity, be a negative thing. So you don't want to box yourself in. But you have to believe in what you're trying to do. And I think, they would have, for example, had enough experience of last year, I suppose, to know where the limitations were and what they would try to get a bit more out of. So it all takes time to get that all to work. As you say, Mercedes had room for manoeuvre. Last year, they were very, very good at some tracks, but very, very bad at others. And that's the thing about the consistency of it. You need to be able to get your car and your team to operate consistently. And if you can do that, then you know where you stand. But if you're up and down like a yo-yo every other weekend, then you really don't know where you are, because, did you just miss the setup? What happened? If it can perform in one weekend, should it perform like that on every weekend? And I've always said it's better to get a sort of stable, I don't know what you like, call it 4th, 6th, 8th on the grid type thing, week in, week out, because then the characteristics of the car start being consistent, and you sort of gives you a direction to go in. But if you're up and down like a yo-yo, then suddenly you have to change your whole development plan very quickly as you learn something new. So I think this last year, these regulations will be the interesting one, because there should not be any hiding places left anymore for anybody. They've been around long enough now to get a good understanding. The teams have changed direction as the period went past with these regulations. So this is it now. This is the end of that sort of cycle to show that you learned about it or you didn't learn about it. And if you didn't learn about it, then you've got to really, really dig deep and look at what's going on within your company, because you definitely haven't got open eyes if you haven't got on top of it by the last year of this cycle.
And I guess the really interesting thing on Mercedes is, because, as we mentioned, Bahrain was so cold by its standards, you've got a Mercedes team that has had problems in warmer conditions, and with the car being erratic, they probably thought, we'll go to Bahrain, this will be great. It'll be a good chance to test the car out. And they didn't get it. So the car looked really accomplished and consistent and well-balanced for the most part on track. But I guess you'll just have this huge question mark in the back of your mind, thinking, well, we've just not been able to prove that it can do it when the temperature goes up.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, because it's very easy to say this, but in my experience, anything that's developing or creating downforce from anywhere near the ground will change its characteristics dramatically with temperature. So for sure, even just the ambient temperature, but also the fact the ambient temperature gets into the track temperature, and the track temperature is it's the other side of that venturi. It's the underfloor of the car. So it's a very important part of that other side of that venturi. So you need to be a little bit careful as to what you think you've fixed until you do get to a random set of temperatures. And as I say, Melbourne might be there, but it might not be as well. I don't think they'll be having sleepless nights about the changes they've done on their car, but there will be the odd nightmare, I think, waking up and thinking, oh, have we really got on top of this? Because you have to start the season. This year, you have to start the season strong, because obviously 2026 is coming thick and fast, and that's a major change. So your top technical people will be sliding across to that very soon in the season, very early in the season. So the thing is, if you start 2025 poorly, you're going to have to keep them there longer, and then that sort of runs into 2026. So it's a big season for everybody. I'd like to get a couple of races under our belt before we sort of able to comment on the consistency of some of these changes, because all of them had shortcomings, I think, at the test. All 4 of the top teams, even all 10 of the teams had shortcomings. It wasn't just a walk in the park for anybody. Everybody was able to make mistakes one way or another, to one level or another. And as we sort of think that McLaren came out on top, but it was mainly because of its long fuel run. It really, that was quite an exceptional run. So it's one of those sort of situations where, to be honest, until the checkered flag falls for 2 or 3 races, we're still in the unknown.
The really interesting thing with these cars is one of the key challenges is getting that front to rear balance across the wide range of speed. And that's always a challenge, but it's a particular challenge with the nature of these cars being very much the downforce generator is the ground effect downforce. And it's interesting when you look at the McLaren, because I watch trackside a lot, really strong and usable front end, but the rear looked quite unstable at times, but in a fairly usable way. But it did look like, if you watched in turn 5, 6, 7, those fast S's, quite unstable. You could see it was quite a wild ride. It never seemed to kind of spit them off the track or anything, so it looked controllable. But it's that problem, isn't it? If you have the strong front end, can the rear keep up across that whole range of speed? So I guess that's the question, isn't it? Particularly when it comes to pushing certain characteristics as hard as you can the rest of the car keep up? And those balances and compromises are there all over the place, aren't they? Well,
I would sort of rather have a car that's got a slightly nervous rear end than a car that's just an understeering package, because with understeer there's nothing the driver can do. You just have to sit and wait on it. You can't use your talent or your muscle, or you can't find ways around it. Whereas with the nervous rear end, you can find ways around it by driving. I mean, you can also find your ways around it by setup changes, obviously. But the big thing is you want to be careful with those setup changes, because you just don't want to develop a car that's got understeer, because, as I say, it makes the car dead. The front end of the car just doesn't work. And you just, as I say, you can't muscle it, you can't do anything with it, whereas with a little bit of nervous rear end, you can. There's a level of nervousness that you can obviously cope with. And that's the level you've got to get yourself within. It's one of these things, as long as it's not different, I think, all the time, that's important. As long as it's consistently got a nervous rear end to a level that you can you know what's going to happen, you can cope with it. It's always just feeling that it's, a bit light or a bit snappy, I suppose you might call it. But if it comes and goes, and one corner you got a bit of understeer, and the next corner you got a nervous rear end, then that's a big problem because the driver just doesn't get any confidence and doesn't know what's going to happen next. It's all about, the rear end is mainly about getting the reaction out of that loaded rear tyre, the outside rear tyre. You turn the front end into a corner, and the time from the driver committing to that, moving the steering wheel, to the fact that the outside rear wheel picks up the load, is nanoseconds, but to the driver it's like a week, and that's the thing he's feeling all the time, is how fast that rear tyre's reacting. And if you've got a tyre that responds very quickly, picks up the slip angle very quickly and picks up the grip very quickly, and that's okay. And that you can play around with in the suspension geometry to get the tyre to be loaded up, a bit more. That's why you run toe in the rear of the car, because it's semi-preloaded to pick up that grip quicker. But that comes all from setup changes, from the camber you're running to the toe in you're running, and again to the springs and whatever you're running to put the load through that tyre. So I would rather have a car that's got a nervous rear end and try to fix that as time went by, and know the driver can hustle it if he wants to, than a car that's just got a ploughing understeer which you just can't do anything with.
So are you with the majority in thinking that you'd be happiest if you were McLaren at this stage based on what you've seen so far, or is it not that clear cut for you?
I don't think it's that clear cut. I think that every circuit, as Andreas Seidel said, every circuit has its own characteristics, and Bahrain does require a car that's got a fairly stable rear end. But I think, if you're going to go to the next track and it be different, front end limited or traction limited or something different then you're always going to have to react differently to it. I don't think it's clear cut between any of the top four teams at the moment. Obviously, we've seen the years whenever a team dominated at the front, even in pre-season testing, and were able to carry that through into the start of the season, and even right through the season. But I don't think we're getting that this year. I think if you look closely at all the times and one thing and another, which I'm doing at the moment to try and put an article together on it, there's room to say that the chipping order could be a bit different. It's obviously all theoretical, but it all happens. It's not just black and white. If it was black and white, we know how good the cars are. We know the competitive running order from pre-season testing, but we know we don't know that. So there's no point in just sitting there thinking it's right. So I think we're still going to see a mix there. What I do think is that when you look closely at it, looking at two drivers in the same team, and the same sort of, how would you say it, mistakes happening, I think that that points to the car, obviously, and that's what the teams need to react to. If say two drivers go out in the same car, a different day, obviously, but and they have the same sort of errors, like the rear end, as you say, not being comfortable, or like the understeer being, as we saw with the Red Bull a few times, the understeer was quite a lot. Then you've got a fundamental car problem you've got to try and fix. But usually the drivers these days, especially in the top teams, they are fairly equal, in reality. Yes, we've got some new boys coming in, but they're not slow. So although they might make some more mistakes, when they make a mistake, they'll be going quick.
I was never really a runner. The way I see running is a gift, especially when you have stage 4 cancer. I'm Anne. I'm running the Boston Marathon, presented by Bank of America. I run for Dana-Farber Cancer Institute to give people like me a chance to thrive in life, even with cancer.
Join Bank of America in helping Anne's cause. Give if you can at BofA.com/supportAnne. What would you like the power to do? References to charitable organizations is not an endorsement by Bank of America Corporation. Copyright 2025.
Uh-oh. The last cookie.
You can get a new box of cookies in as fast as an hour with Walmart Express Delivery.
Are you my guilty self-conscience?
No, I'm the voice offering you promo code EXPRESS for free delivery on your first order.
Hey, who ate my cookies?
You mean, these cookies?
Order now. Welcome to your Walmart. Promotion valid for first express delivery order. $50 minimum subject to availability. Restrictions apply.
Here at the Almond Joy Factory, where tropical vibes abound, we use soft, fresh-tasting coconut.
The crunchiest almonds and delicious chocolate candy.
Ah, but do you know what our most important ingredient is? Sometimes you feel like a nut.
Sometimes you don't.
Almond Joy's got nuts and something even way better than that. Yes, Almond Joy is made with almonds and joy.
Well, as always on this podcast, listener questions is one of the key components, and we've got a bumper crop of those after testing and heading into the Australian Grand Prix. So I'm going to throw some questions at Gary from them. And of course, if you want to ask a question of Gary for a future episode, you can send it through to podcast@therace.com. That's podcast@the-race.com. And those can be technically oriented, but that's a very broad definition. As long as it's tangentially, at least, technical in nature, we will endeavour to get through as many as we can. But let's get into our current batch. The first one comes from Protonic Arrow, who says, is the Sakir circuit in Bahrain a better testing venue than Barcelona in that it pushes the cars more, or is better representative than previous testing venues? So I guess this is Bahrain versus Barcelona, really, isn't it?
Yeah. No, I don't think so. I personally think that Barcelona is one of the most demanding tracks on the calendar. It's got a bit of everything, especially the long corners, the 180-degree corners, which has got turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, all varying in speed. It really is quite a tricky track. The big change there was because of the first race of the year was out that way, so suddenly it became a viable thing to go to Bahrain, and also the fact that the weather in Europe had a couple of 3 years where it really wasn't very good, and because of limiting testing, they wanted to go somewhere where they could more or less guarantee sunshine. Didn't work out that way this year, but in the past it's been okay. But I think Bahrain suffers from the wind and the sand blowing onto it, which can change the track. So I don't think there's any perfect track, to be honest, at that time of the year. But Bahrain was deemed to be, not too big a time zone difference, not too far to get to with bits and pieces. So it was sort of a better potential package because of the weather than Barcelona. But I think as far as a track's concerned, in the same equal condition, equal set of circumstances, Barcelona is a better test track.
And we should see the return of Barcelona next year because there's more pre-season testing for the new cars. So I think we'll start in Barcelona, then move on. Right, the next question comes from Kia, who says, given that the Ferrari has been set up with less anti-dive than its direct competitors, and it was a lack of ability to feel a front under braking in the Mercedes that caused Hamilton's issues last season, do you believe that these factors are leading to Lewis Hamilton's apparent extra confidence on track, and will this hurt the aero platform?
Well, you said it yourself there, Keir, that Lewis Hamilton's apparent extra confidence on the track. I think it's always difficult to judge until you're in a set of circumstances that's the same for everybody. In other words, qualifying at a Grand Prix, when the cars are on low fuel, high engine modes, and it's about the driver wringing its neck and getting the best out of it. Anything you're doing characteristics to support the car under braking will always remove the driver feel from the car a bit. It depends on how you do it. It depends on what the driver really uses as feel, I suppose you might call it. So yes, I think less anti-dive, and we can only comment visibly on this anti-dive situation. We can't really say it's less or more, because until you lay out the geometry and actually see what's going on and work out the loads and all the suspension members, then you don't really know what's going on. So we're only commenting what we visibly see. But I think less anti-dive will be a better solution to Lewis and to a lot of drivers. But then you've got to make sure that the aero platform underneath the car can cope with that extra little bit of movement, or you can manage it in some other way. So you can't just forsake one for the other. The two have to go hand in hand. It's 99.9%. It's the aero platform you're trying to make sure you're controlling, and if you have to use a suspension to do that, so be it. But that suspension change then, as I say, taking away some of the feel of the car is not a good thing for some drivers. For others, it's fine, but for some drivers, it's not a great thing.
Let's move on now to a question from Andrew Sillett. Is Flovis paint not a massive giveaway to rival teams? Why not use a material that only becomes visible under an ultraviolet light?
Well, teams do that or have done that as well, but it's a sort of one of these trends that's just there with the Flovis. It's just something that's quick and nasty and easy. I mean, you'll see whenever you see the aero rakes on the cars, they're really, the development of the cars and what you're doing with airflow is all about what's off the car surface, not on the car surface. So it's, there are huge aero rakes on the cars measuring outside the wheels, much higher than the cars, etc., etc. So it's all of that and how you're managing that external flow that's important. So I think the Flovis is one of these rude and nasty ways of seeing if you got any little pockets of separation that could be hurting you. Does it give anything away to the teams? I mean, the way I see some of it put on, we saw, I think there was Lando Norris, McLaren, they just covered it in it. I mean, it was running off it going down the pit lane. The airflow on the surface of the car isn't strong enough in a lot of areas to cope with that weight of liquid. So at the end of the day, is the answers you get from Flovis any good? I mean, way back in the old days before Flovis was sort of invented, we used to use a sort of light oil, just spray it on and then look at the oil streaks on the wings, which give you an indication of where you were getting airflow separation problems with the transition to the end plates were, etc. But it's just one of these things that people do, and it does do something. You want to spray the front wishbones and see where that airflow coming off the wishbones is going. Does it give away anything to the other teams? I don't think it's that relevant.
So when you send a car out with Flovis on and it comes back, what are you actually looking at in terms of the paint formations and that kind of thing? What can it tell you?
Well, there's two or three things. I mean, if you're looking at a surface and trying to see where that flow's going on that surface, then you look at the streaks of the flow and you see where it's potentially not going where you thought it might go, or the fact that, as I say, you can get it puddling in an area, which is sort of indicating maybe separation, or that you put it on too heavily. And if you put it onto the front wing, you're looking at where the airflow coming off the front wing ends up, where it gets to the car next. For example, is it going into the radiator duct? Is it going over the top of the radiator duct, or is it going underneath that in that undercut? So that's the sort of things you're trying to find out if your philosophy or your understanding from the wind tunnel and from CFD is actually in the real world doing the same sort of thing. There is good indication, in CFD. We used to have a system where you had the Flovis in a little tank and a windscreen washer pump, and you just, when you were going around the circuit, you set the pump off and it would pump it out onto certain areas. So it was actually live. It wasn't as though you're sitting in the pits or driving down the pit lane and it's all dropping into big puddles. It was, you were doing 150 k's or whatever it was you wanted to do your test at. Hit the pump, switch it on, and the spray would come out, and it would go where that airspeed was going at that point in time. It wouldn't be disturbed because it's been building up to that speed. I always thought that worked better for us. It was the flow lines were much more what you call uniform, because it just all got hit with that airspeed immediately. So as I say, it's one of those sort of trends. They'll take pictures, lots and lots of pictures of it, and try and correlate it with the flow from CFD, because you get the visualization flow from CFD as well. It's just a means to an end, trying to do something, because you got 1,000 people working there. You got to give them a job doing something. So you might as well give them a job of taking pictures of Flovis and trying to correlate it with, as I say, what CFD's predicted for certain areas. But when you see some of the flow that we saw, there was a couple of times on the Red Bull that I saw, and I thought, well, that's a bit strange. But you need to know where it's originated from, what the plan was, where you put the Flovis on to begin with, never mind where the lines are. And as I say, that episode with the McLaren, it was just a mess. Whenever you seen the Flovis, it was just a mess. Nobody could decipher that.
Now we move on to a question from Matthew Kemsley, which is touching on something we've broadly talked about in the first part, but not quite in these specific terms. Could the McLaren rear instability be from the extreme suspension setup they are running to maximise the anti-dive?
Yes, I would say 100% is coming from something in the suspension system. It's one of those sort of areas, again, as you say, Ed, we've talked about it. There's characteristics on a car. For example, you arrive at a corner and you have suspension setups that's resisting the braking force and the weight transfer as such. So it's reducing the car movement. But the one thing you got to remember is that during that period, the car has slowed down from 300 plus kilometres to maybe 100 kilometres. And when you come off the brake pedal, the load has changed, the aerodynamic load has changed. So the car will want to find its new position in life with that aero load that's on it now, the new aero load, and it has to find that right at the point in time you're going to turn the steering wheel. So it's all right trying to support the car and keep the aerodynamic platform as stable as possible during that episode of braking. But you've also got to make sure that the transition for the new load from having 4,000 kilograms of downforce on it to now having 1,000 kilograms of downforce on it. That new load and the spring rates you're running, the car's got to settle in that position. So it's a combination of all that happening at the right time, and that's not something you learn about overnight. You just need to work on it and keep on working on it and keep on working on the setup to make sure that transition between, as I say, the high downforce levels of high speed for the lower downforce levels at low speed, that transition is not disrupting what the driver feels.
Now we've got a question from Andrea, who says, does going to the limit for a quali run in a lower engine mode make a big difference to doing it in a higher engine mode? Would it make a difference to car behaviour, or do they really get a feeling for the limit of the car?
Yeah, it depends on what your engine mode is. There's lots of talk about engine modes, but engine mode, the real out-and-out engine modes are about fight and drag, top speed. Mid-corner, what you want to do is have the driver's torque demand, throttle pedal. You want to make sure that you're giving him what he wants. So if you got 100% torque available at full throttle, be it from the electric motor or from the engine, that he wants 60% at this point in time, you want to give him 60% of the power of your maximum torque that's available. And that's the time it will affect the car handling through the middle of the corner when he's trying to get the car to respond to being loaded up and being driven. Because you obviously come into a corner, you brake, you turn in, you get back in the throttle, and then from there on in, it's about applying the throttle as quickly as you can to get to max throttle. So that area, even no matter what the engine mode would be, that area of engine mode would probably be the same. So your car characteristics through the corner would be the same. What you wouldn't have is just running the engine into the ground with excessive power output going down the straight. So you might be 5Ks or 10Ks slower even in the straight just because of that. But that's not really going to change the car characteristic. So all the time that, as a team, that what you haven't got as far as top speed's concerned, that's easy enough to simulate and say, well, that would have been an XYZ lap time if we'd had full engine mode. But through the corner, you want to have, the driver wants to be demanding what the car will cope with through that corner. And that's always going to be there.
Now we have a question from Chris Dawson. Do you think Red Bull's car geometry is so similar to last year's because they're banking on the flexi-wing rules to knock their competitors down a peg or two mid-season?
I think if they have left the suspension geometry as last year, then they've left it there because that's what they believe in. That's what they feel is adequate, I suppose you might call it. The flexi-wing rules confused me a little bit with Red Bull because I've been preaching on about it for years when I've been watching it on TV, watching the front wing flaps dropping and, whatever, and coming back up again, coming back up whenever you brake at the end of the straight, dropping down, going down the straight. There was a video during the test of a Red Bull front wing, and the flap just sort of disappeared out of sight. To be honest, that looked quite dramatic to me. It was a lot. I think there's a level where what you want to do is I keep saying this, it's the rotation of the front wing and not the bending of the front wing. But what you want to do is make sure that it's rotating, losing less downforce. And again, I'm saying this word I use all the time consistently, because you don't want to have a cliff edge where suddenly the front wing is just dropping down and failing. And you got to be very careful as well, because you can very quickly have a front wing that's working very hard, almost, let's say, into airflow separation characteristics on the underside of it, and then you go faster, the wing backs off, and the wing actually starts working more. I've seen quite a few times, and I think one of the guys you could ask about is the Jenson Button. I remember a few times in the McLaren where he had characteristics where you notice the car had understeer, put on some front wing, the car understeered more, and vice versa. Took off some front wing because the rear of the car was nervous, and the rear of the car got more nervous, and that's just because the front wing's working at a point where it's its characteristics is not, I want a little bit more front wing, I'll put a little bit more front wing on it, because it's very easy to get less. And I think that's where you've got to be careful. Whenever you've got a front wing that's backing off with speed, because the downforce will always increase, even though the separation's there. It's not like a light switch. It's a dimmer switch, I suppose you might call it. But it's very easy for a front wing that's backing off a bit because of flexing to actually start to produce more downforce. So you need to make sure you've done your homework.
I think the Red Bull's going to be one of the most interesting cars this season, because obviously it looks fairly similar. They have said they've changed all the aero surfaces, loads of changes under the skin. The car's a little bit lighter, so they've got a bit more ballast, flexibility. They've created some extra aerodynamic opportunity, some extra space here and there to really make the most of it, particularly at the front of the floor. So I guess this is the clear test, isn't it, for almost the post-Newey Red Bull. And obviously the existing technical team was kind of taking over even before Newey left, based on what Newey said. So this is kind of the test of whether just getting the flexi wing right and fixing a few limitations on the basic concept works well, and how much those under the surface changes have actually changed the performance potential of the car. Really interesting season for them ahead, I think.
Yeah, it will be an interesting season, because they led the way dramatically in 2022 and 2023, and as Adrian says, during 2023 he felt there was characteristics coming in that he didn't like the idea of. I've as I've said many times, I'm a big believer in the front wing slot gap to the front element, because you're trying to get that airflow through from there, and it goes up the underside of the nose, which is a lot of profile on the underside of the nose, and then it's introduced to the leading edge of the underfloor. And as you just said, they've done quite a bit of work on the opening up the leading edge of the underfloor to get more flow there. Both Mercedes and Red Bull tested a front wing with a slot gap there as opposed to a front wing without a slot gap. And I'm interested to see what they appear with. Because, again, in the article I wrote a few weeks ago, there's no black and white answer to it. It's the characteristics of what happens. And, the characteristic of what happens with the slot gap is something that is more consistent for sure than without it, and how the flow gets to the underflow, etc., etc. But I think if you just took black and white numbers from the wind tunnel, you would be fairly convinced that no slot gap was giving me more front end at low speed, because that part of the wing would work pretty hard at low speed. It's the furthest forward, it's the lowest part of it, all that stuff. But that doesn't say that it continues like that. And part of these cars that's difficult to do is actually to research the aerodynamic platform characteristics when the car's near the ground, because you can't put the wind tunnel model, you can't drive it into the ground. Now we see sparks from underneath these cars going down the straights. That's for a reason, isn't it? They're on the ground, and that's an area where you haven't been able to research it. So you have to have a little bit of a gut feel as to what the next stage would be from the wind tunnel data you gathered. You're lowering it down, you're getting nearer and nearer and nearer to the ground. And then I think in most cases, the downforce will be increasing. And to somebody who doesn't have the right sort of gut feel, they'll say, oh yeah, well that's it, we've got to just keep going, we're okay there, because we'll have massive amount of downforce with the next millimetre or 2 millimetres of movement. But it doesn't work like that, because that's whenever things start to deteriorate dramatically with airflow stalling and separation problems and inconsistencies. So Red Bull, they probably have changed every aerodynamic surface. I mean, the car's probably 100% new, but still, it's still from the same family, I think you might call it.
This episode is brought to you by Coffee Mate. After watching this season of the HBO's original series, The White Lotus, This is the tropical getaway I needed. One more pina colada, please.
Hey, you're not on mute.
Oh, I thought I was in paradise. Turns out it was my coffee mate. Coffee Mate Pina Colada and Thai-iced coffee-flavored creamers. Inspired by the newest season of HBO's original series, The White Lotus. For the love of coffee. Try now.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistant's assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Take your plans out of the group chat and get long weekend ready in new Abercrombie. From day to night, pack new outfits for every part of your itinerary. Grabbing brunch? Throw on the A&F Mila dress. Then head to your dinner reservation in their new bubble hem mini dress. And yes, permission to overpack for pics with the girls. Abercrombie's best-selling Scarlet Squirt deserves a post in your feed. Your plans are worth it. Shop Abercrombie's new long weekend collection online or in store.
Right, we've got another batch of questions for the final part of this podcast. And remember, if you'd like to send in a question for a future episode, it's podcast@therace.com. That's podcast@the-race.com. So the first one for this section comes from Ed R. Gaming. What are the advantages and disadvantages of teams running drivers for half a day versus a full day in testing? If you're a team boss, which would you choose?
If I was a team boss, well, when I was a team boss as such, it was normally the guy that paid the most money. But no, but getting serious about it, I think that the half day is not bad. I mean, in theory, it's a full day because you give one driver the first half day, then second driver that half day, the afternoon, then he stays in for the morning of the next day. So you do get a bit of a relay as to what goes on. You're not, you're just making sure the driver isn't driving all day long, because it's very easy in one of these cars to actually just tweak your neck, just the neck muscle, just suddenly just hit a curb wrong or something. And the more running you do consistently, the more chance of something happening. So I would go for the half day. As I say, one driver first morning, the other driver the afternoon. He stays in for the first morning of the next day, and then change over. So they end up, getting a bit of a relay job. And I think it's the most productive part for it, because you can also, that way you can sort of balance out the track changes, the circuit changes from morning to afternoon. It's one of those sort of things where I think you get more ground made if you do it that way. The driver's a little bit fresher. He's been able to stand around and watch what's going on, so he gets into the car, let's say for the afternoon after the other driver's been in for the morning, with a more positive direction rather than not showing up the next morning because he's had a lie-in type thing. So yeah, I would do the half days.
And it's something that's changed quite a lot over the past 10, 12 years, because you've gone from a point where doing 100 laps in a day of testing pre-season was a lot to now that just being the kind of almost minimum, isn't it? You want to get a lot of laps done in a day, so that just wear on the driver has become a much bigger factor than it was, say, 20 years ago, for example. Right, the next question comes from Jamie Stark. What situation would a team prefer? Turn up at testing with a fast car but limited knowledge of how to develop it, a la Aston Martin in 2023, or a slow car but with a clear understanding of its faults and how to upgrade it, like Alpine in 2024? Neither of those situations are much fun, are they?
Neither are much fun, no. I mean, it's the Alpine situation, 2024, I think it was fairly sort of black and white, the fact the car was so overweight. They had to fix all that stuff. But, you never want that to happen, because while you're trying to recover from that situation, you're not moving forward. You may have your development plan in place for the first start of the season, but every time you run the car, you learn something new. So that development plan that you've sort of kept back as such to develop as the season progresses, that's 6 months out of date or 4 months out of date. So you want to always react into the situation you've got. And I think the Aston Martin 2023 showing up being quick is the best way to go, but you have to react to the situation in front of you, read the problems correctly, and move in the right direction. Now, that's not easy, but that's every team's objective. So you need to make sure that you don't believe what you want to believe. You have to believe what's in front of you, and the stopwatch never lies. And I think Aston Martin fell foul of that a little bit. They started the season so well that whenever they got themselves into a little bit of problem with developments going in the car, they didn't react fast enough to regroup and go in a different direction, or limit the direction they were going in, I suppose. So I'd rather be the Aston Martin of 2023 or the McLaren even of 2024, Alpine of 2024. They recovered during the season, but I'd rather start the season strong and hope that you can maintain that depth of competitiveness.
And of course, it's worth noting that it's not as if Aston Martin didn't think that they knew how to develop it early in 23. They were talking about closing the gap to Red Bull, so they thought they were on the right track. So, it's the understanding that's the key, isn't it? The next question comes from Jake, who says, is there any point in sandbagging in testing? I've never really understood why it matters if the other teams know you're fast, especially in the era of limited testing. If the others know you're fast, they can't exactly do anything about it straight away.
No, and they can't do anything about it anyway, unless they know that they haven't built a car that's fast enough. It's not rocket science. You put your package together, you appear at a racetrack, and you do the best job you can. And I have to question, what is sandbagging? I mean, we talked earlier about running engine modes and not using the straight line speed that potentially was in the car, etc., etc. But I think on most occasions the teams are clever enough to go out and they're looking at corner speeds. They're looking at lots and lots of stuff. So although the lap time might not be there, the other teams know enough about the fact that where a car's fast and where it's not fast at. I mean, in the old days, you used to lift in the last two corners before the teams really sort of got clever about going out on the track and analysing engine RPM and etc. But you can't do that nowadays, lifting just for the last bit and not doing the lap time. The lap time is there. It's so black and white now from all the section points that, you can do 90% of a fast lap. And the last 10%, everybody knows that you haven't pushed hard in that last bit, but they know there's 90%. And if you had the same performance over that last 10%, it would give you X, Y, Z lap time. So I think sandbagging is a bit of a loose word, just it sounds good, but it's not really done anymore.
Now we've got a question from Christopher McDonald. Is the major difference in these regs compared to the previous ones that the theoretical limit and the practical limit are not the same? I've read a few technical people in teams say they can't just throw downforce on the car like in the past. How close to the practical limit are these cars? Are they within a few percent or even less than 1%?
That's a very difficult one to answer because it's obviously a package of the car, and the last thing in the chain, the last link in the chain is the four tyres that connect it to the ground. So yeah, if you overpower them with too much downforce, let's say, it will the tyre won't react to it in the proper way. But I'd say that the big thing about this percentage and about technical people talking about they can't just throw downforce on the car is because the majority of the downforce now comes from the underfloor, and the underfloor and the ground are two. They're very good friends at times, but they're also very big enemies at times. Whereas before, the regulations up till 2022, it was mainly upper body downforce. So it's all stuff that wasn't sensitive to ground effect, I suppose you might call it. So you could fire on as much downforce as you could find from all the barge board assemblies. And, whenever we were talking about those barge board assemblies, the really complicated ones, they were probably creating, 20% of the downforce of the car. Not in themselves, but just in how the airflow characteristics around the car was managed. Airflow structure was managed by those barge boards. 20% is probably a low percentage. So if you did increase that and make it work harder, yeah, you could run into trouble with the ground because of the side of the floor, etc. But generally it was a small amount of trouble. Whereas with these ground effect cars, no, you get into a huge amount of trouble. So I can completely understand people saying they can't just fire downforce at it, but that's because they're firing downforce at it from the underfloor. And if you look at the teams that tested the 2026 potentially Pirelli tyres, I mean, they ran the cars around a racing circuit with, more or less Monza rear wing on it around a circuit where you would run maximum rear wing, just because they wanted to characterize the loads on the tires as best possible. Just get the information for the tires needed a lot less downforce, but they took wings off to do that, a lot of wing off. So in effect, some of the teams that did that will actually learn a little bit, because instead of it being like 75-80% of the downforce of the car from the underfloor and 25-30% from the wings, it would be 10% from the wings and 90% from the underfloor. So some teams that did those tests, if they're clever enough or if they think about it deeply enough, they will have got a good idea of what their underfloor characteristics are like with less upper body downforce. So, they might sort of understand it a little bit better by running the car with less wing downforce.
Now a question from Clay Woolcock. Given the cost cap is now entrenched, what reason could there be for not allowing in-season testing at venues of the team's choice following the pre-season test? The FIA could set a minimum per-day cost for testing for the team's budgets, which could negate the advantage Ferrari has of having Fiorano, and it would allow teams to actually get the cars out on track. Seeing as I seem to recall in the late 2000s, cost was the main reason for banning in-season testing. Now that costs are fixed, to a degree anyway, I can't seem to think of a reason to keep in-season testing off-limits to teams. Add in a possible rule that testing can only be done with non-race drivers, and it would give young drivers opportunities to drive up-to-date machinery, maybe making it worthwhile to be a test and reserve driver. It's an interesting question, this one, isn't it, Gary? Carlos Sainz complained about this, and certainly in a cost cap era, there's a good argument there, isn't there?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Clay. It's just one of those sort of things. Time goes by. So whenever the banning of testing or the reduction of testing came in, teams went away and spent multi-million dollars on in-house simulation equipment, including driver and the loop simulators, etc. So the teams will always find a way to spend money, is what I've always said. But there is nothing, as we know, there is nothing as good as running the car around the track. Doesn't matter how good your simulator is. The one thing we always hear about is correlation. And the end result is that, I believe you're right. I believe the car should be running the track, maybe a limited amount of days, but per season, it's up to the team to pick what days they want it. Maybe a limited amount of tracks. But at the end of the day, you can't keep changing your mind about these things, because the teams will always go and spend the money. It's like now, if you turned around and said, okay, we're not going to have wind tunnels anymore, which there's been rumours of, And we got Aston Martin, McLaren have just finished spend on a new wind tunnel. Various teams have just spent multi millions on a new wind tunnel. And if the governing body just turned around one day and said, we're not having wind tunnels anymore, so that money's all down the pan. So the long-term plan should be a sort of compromise in everything. And as you say, the cost cap should look after it. And as long as it was the same amount of days for everybody, then if Ferrari wanted to go off and test at Fiorano, so be it. That's their own home test track. But if you had, let's say 10 days of testing that you could do during the season, and it had to be all in Europe, then I think it would be good for everybody, because all this stuff we hear where the correlation's not good that would sort of start to get diluted to a certain extent, because you'd be doing more real world running. And again, as you say, half of those days should be done with a driver who hasn't done X Grand Prix. Just so you do introduce these younger drivers to Formula One cars and environment earlier in their career.
Yeah, absolutely. And that driver side, both for established drivers and the rookies, it's a win, isn't it? As Fernando Alonso likes to say, you don't stop tennis players from practicing, so it's just an extra chance for them to sharpen their skills. So it makes a lot of sense there. Well, thanks very much for those excellent questions and, of course, the outstanding answers from Gary. We're going to be taking on as many questions as we can from listeners over the course of the year. And now we're going to turn our attention to Melbourne and the Australian Grand Prix. And we'll be back after that race for more from Gary.